Charles. My name is Charles Evelyn. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Link Senior. This is our 5th annual Activity Strong Summit. I can't believe it's 5 years now. But as a reminder, Activity Strong is an effort led by Link Senior in partnership with NAP, NCAP, and Activity Connection. And this year, we, quote unquote, took a stand to celebrate life, to celebrate all lives, including the ones of people living with cognitive change. This is why the event is dubbed Dementia Disco, and it's for us to think deeper about dementia inclusion. And as I've prompted the audience on past sessions, if you have no idea what we're thinking about, just think of this simple question, which is, if I told you I had dementia today, would you treat me differently and why? And that's a great way, one of many ways, but that's a great way to start that discussion. As we're about to invite panelists for our 4th session today, I want to just go through quick housekeeping reminders, and then we'll get started. So as a reminder, we can earn up to 6 NAB, NCAP, NCTRC, and NCCDPC credits. To earn the credits, you need to attend the 4 sessions, so as few as 1, as many as 6. And to get the certificate, you need to fill out the CU surveys no later than midnight on Friday, June 28th, so we can process your certificates. Again, you can earn up to 6 hours for these, and just note that due to the high number of attendees, these certificates will be sent out via email throughout the week of July 8th to July 12th because of the holiday weekend. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at webinars@linksenior.com. This session is being recorded, and as you probably noticed, the audience was very active through the chat and the Q&A feature. If you want to chat and see that everyone sees your contribution, make sure you select the everyone from the dropdown. And with learning, I also want to invite you all to have fun and to consider these great panels. So with that, I wanted to invite Maura. Thank you, Maura, for being with us. Jen, Kirsten. Is Kirsten on by any chance?
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Kirsten.
Thanks.
So very excited to have you. This is our 4th session, as I mentioned. We're going to be talking about embracing inclusion in dementia care. And Maura Welsh is going to be our moderator. Maura is the author of Happily Ever Older, Revolutionary Approaches to Long-Term Care. With that, I want to invite the 4 of you for joining us. Maura, take it away, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Charles. And just to note, the session before us was absolutely profound. I learned so much by listening in. So grateful to be part of this event today. As we all know, any of us attending this event today may one day develop cognitive decline. It could come earlier or later, or not at all. But the point is that barring any sweeping medical advances, it will be the experience of a great many. And that is one of the reasons why the movement towards the inclusion of people living with dementia in everyday life is so important. I know a woman who does incredibly compassionate work with older adults, and she told me that decades ago, while working as a healthcare aide, she tied up people in their chairs because restraining older adults was what was done at that time. Safety was the justification, although in hindsight, she recognized the pain it caused. Many homes have shifted from physical to chemical restraints or other types of restraints, perhaps locked doors. Sometimes it is our societal beliefs that curtail freedom, the way we view people with a dementia diagnosis. But ideas change, and in many ways, these are exciting times around the concept of inclusion of people living with cognitive decline. Neuroscience now tells us that older brains have plasticity, so under the right circumstances with an enriched lifestyle, people living with dementia will continue to live with great purpose. It is the way we would all want to live if or when it is our turn. This comes with the recognition among some operators of homes, day programs, and other services that we need to stop excluding people based on a health diagnosis. For others, These may seem like lofty concepts, given government regulations or demands from families to put safety first, but people are listening. So on today's panel, you will hear from 3 innovators, 2 of whom have been doing hands-on work of creating change, and a third who works with organizations across North America and beyond, helping them reach new goals. So let's meet everyone. Jen Wilson is the Vice President of Wellbeing at Carol Woods Retirement Community in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Jen leads resident support services along the continuum of care, including primary care, rehabilitation, social work, fitness, assisted living, and skilled nursing. Her work centers on building team capacity to provide individualized support that upholds dignity, meaning, worth, and belonging among residents. Prior to her 16 years at Carol Woods, she worked at the Carolinas Center for Medical Excellence, coaching North Carolina nursing homes through quality improvements to implement person-centered care and reduce restraint use. Jen holds a Master of Public Health degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Danielle Weatherholtz-Palmer began volunteering at her local nursing home in high school and enjoyed listening to resident stories as she served them ice cream. Many of those people still lived in the nursing home when she returned as a social worker and later became the administrator. In time, those residents became like family and joined her family dinners on special occasions. Later, in honor of their friendship, she was asked to write their eulogies. After making the decision to leave her role as administrator, Danielle is now Director of Resident Services at a continuing care community called Shenandoah Valley, Westminster, Canterbury. Growing up in a rural community, she has seen the struggles of aging, with family, friends, and strangers calling for advice. Danielle's hope is to make a difference in the lives of all older adults. Kirsten M. Jacobs is Vice President, Shared Learning Initiatives at Leading Age. With over 20 years of experience in older adult housing services and long-term care management, Kirsten credits her late grandparents for her commitment to the field. Her undergraduate thesis project, dedicated to sharing art with older adults, set the stage for an ongoing interest in dementia and holistic well-being. Kirsten has held various positions, including administrator and executive director. Currently, she serves on the knowledge team at Leading Age, a national association of elder service organizations, where she leads the organization's wellness and dementia education strategy. She also guides a diverse set of education initiatives to advance Leading Age's ageism work and strategic focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Kirsten is currently a director on the Rose Villa Senior Living Board. She earned a Master of Social Work and Gerontology certificate from the Portland State University and a Bachelor of Arts in Art Administration with a minor in studio art from Scripps College in Claremont, California. She lives in her hometown of Portland, Oregon with her spouse, 2 kids, and a goofy dog. So let's begin. There's so much to discuss. Kirsten, you and Jen work together, and it is my understanding that you hold a lot of discussions about creating change. But as this conversation begins, can you give us a foundational understanding of the intersection of ageism and ableism? How does the lack of inclusion impact individuals and families?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. What a treat to be among this delightful crew. Thank you so much for the invitation. First, I'll share that I'm joining you from an Airbnb in Philadelphia. So who knows what could happen with the internet and my children and all the things. So that's that. I think these are really important lenses to bring into this conversation. So I appreciate this as the sort of initial framing. Ageism is something we all encounter and know. It is discrimination based on a person's age, and that's any age. We live in a really youth-centered society in the United States. And of course, in our field, we tend to focus on discrimination towards older adults. But Any flip comments about younger generations, like those things we hear people say about millennials? Those are manifestations of ageism as well. So in organizations where sometimes we even have a preschool, so we may have 4-year-olds all the way up to the 103-year-old who lives in the health center, that's a lot of ages and a lot of generations in community. So ageism manifests internally, the internalized feelings that we hold around age and change. It manifests interpersonally as we interact with each other within our organizations, in policies, and then, of course, in the society that we work in and live in. Ableism is social prejudice against people with disabilities, with this sort of false assumption that to have, quote, normal abilities is superior. And we all know all the layers of problematic that brings. But at the intersection of ableism and ageism, we find a lot of fear. And I've seen some of you already reference it in the chat, this dynamic that we see between people living with cognitive change and people not living with cognitive change, people living with changing physical abilities and not. And what does that mean when we're living in communities if there's fear and stigma around age and ability? And we work in settings that often inadvertently segregate and reinforce. We segregate based on age, we segregate based on ability. And in many ways, it is just built into the way we do things. So very well intentioned. So if I'm living with dementia or another changing ability, which is often the reality as we get older, and I know that I have to move to another level of care, leave my neighbor, leave my spouse, leave the community that I love and treasure, I may be apt to hide that changing cognition or the changing physical ability. And that means maybe I don't get the adaptive advice or support that I need or devices that I need. It could mean that I don't get the support I need. And we know that that can lead to the isolation that you mentioned at the opening. So that's just one of many examples, but I think we've all seen it happen. We've seen the no wheelchairs in the dining room, no walkers in the dining room. We've had those conversations. I see nodding. I remember saying to a resident in independent living, I promise I will advocate for you when you need a walker. And right now we need to work together to include everyone else in this community. And I still believe that that's so important because that cycle of fear is a really tricky cycle to break when we're all living and working together. So I think those are a few layers to consider when we're thinking about integration and inclusion.
It's so interesting and complex. And Jen, your work at Carol Woods is pushing boundaries on the way that residents who do not have cognitive decline, and we as a broader society as well, view people living with dementia or physical challenges, as Kirsten has noted. And I wanted to sort of create a bit of a setting around Carol Woods because I think it's really indicative of the ways that change can come to all of us living with or without dementia. When I visited Carol Woods in 2019, I was just taken by the beauty of the surroundings and the connection to nature and the nearby forest. And as we well know from research, that being in nature and gardening or walking is good for us, particularly those with cognitive decline. So can you describe the value to residents and in a sense, ultimately to some of the operators who would be listening to this of reinforcing that connection to the outdoors, the freedom to be gardening or to be walking, which in its own way is another form of inclusion?
Thank you, Moira. And thank you for including me as part of this panel. And it's such a pleasure to be part of a disco on a Tuesday afternoon, particularly related to dementia. So I'm glad to be here and appreciate the reflection on our setting here at Carol Woods. We're named after Woods and Carolina for a reason. We're here on a lovely 120 acres. It's very much like a park. We have gardens that some are very blatantly out there and some are tucked away. Residents tend to come to live at Carroll Woods for the community, for the access to the higher levels of support when they need it, and also for the beautiful connection to nature. Our very nature-oriented community. Every morning, and now it's 95 degrees here, so early in the morning, it's almost like there's a parade going around a circle in the kind of loops around campus because folks are wanting to get some time outside. So that connection to nature is important, and really, why is that important? It's a big question. It's also pretty straightforward too. Being outdoors and being able to move around freely is just an important part of well-being, right? We want a connection to what's important to us and to being able to have that sense of autonomy that comes from moving. I find residents here enjoy going outdoors because they like to walk, they like to feel the breeze, they like to tend their garden, they like to just move around, they like to get out of where they spend most of their time. Getting outdoors, I think, is a huge part of filling all the cups. We talk about well-being here as being a set of cups to fill that's based on a framework developed by people living with dementia. And this is one it can be connected to your identity to be outdoors. It can be connected to having a connection to nature. It might be something that's fun. It might be an opportunity for growth. As we tend to garden, we often grow ourselves too. It can be something that really helps us to find balance in the day too, whether it's because it's more of a meditative activity or because we're able to be up and moving around and having some action in the day. So being outdoors is just really important to that sense of humanity. And we find here that it's really important for us as a community to not have an area that locks people and prevents them from being able to go outside. Residents at Carroll Woods live in 3 levels of support. We have independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing. No separate area for people living with dementia, and no locked areas. And one of the reasons for that is that we believe in the power of freedom of movement. And we want a person to be able to go outside, whether it's because they're looking for their lost child or because they want to go for the morning walk that they go for every day. That freedom of movement really helps to enhance quality of life. And we've seen that in the time that we've been here, and we've seen ourselves as a community be able to support residents to move about if they need somebody to help them find their way safely home. But ultimately, there's less distress from being able to have that freedom to move about than there would be from being prevented from being able to feel the wind in your hair or tend to your garden or walk outside with a friend. And so that connection to nature and that desire to be out there does not change once a person is diagnosed with dementia.
Thank you. Danielle, I'm going to ask another setting question here for you because you work in a rural area in Virginia, and sometimes the rural areas get less attention in conversations than others. But where you work, many people know each other very well and are likely in the community to see the physical and cognitive changes brought on by time. So from your perspective, do you see segregation even philosophically in your community? And if you do, what is the impact of this when everyone knows each other so well and suddenly an individual or family may be ostracized? How do you help people turn those ideas around? There's a few questions thrown in there, but I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. And just echoing what all of the other panelists said, thank you for allowing me to speak today. But yes, to answer your question, I think it's inevitable. People shy away for a number of reasons, but mainly because they're afraid of not knowing what to say, afraid of what may be in the future of their loved ones or themselves. And we have to remember that these are their friends, these are coworkers, neighbors, and I would say from my experiences, as we age, it's hard to deal with these changes. One day you're talking to an old friend and the next day they have changed. They are the same person, but they're not the same person. And I don't feel that as a society, people are prepared. Even healthcare workers, I don't feel are 100% prepared. And being ostracized is harmful and unproductive for all parties. The person living with a cognitive change, their families, and the staff that are providing the support and care. At Westminster Canterbury, we created the IDIC, which stands for the Interdisciplinary Dementia Inclusive Committee. It's made up of staff from all disciplines, and then we also have resident liaisons. We host support groups, the Memory Cafe. We offer suggestions of how to make our campus more dementia friendly and provide support to the resident and education to staff and the residents and their families. And the main thing is we talk about dementia and cognitive changes. We don't shy away from it. We talk about it with everyone and at many opportunities and different opportunities, places that you may think that, they're kind of bringing this up now. Well, yeah, we are. So we're trying to break the stigma of dementia.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure it's well received by the community. It makes a difference in people's lives. Kirsten, you have spoken quite eloquently about being on the right side of history when it comes to eliminating physical, chemical, or philosophical segregation. How does science support your argument for inclusion? And I'll give you an example. I work for the Toronto Star, and in Toronto, the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest has found that neuroplasticity in older adults, including people with dementia, enables some rewiring, so to speak. I'm saying that in very simple terms, to help people improve their functioning, even if it's just for a time, because we know that dementia always progresses. And we know that social isolation can be linked to dementia. So from your perspective, how can research such as this help individual operators make the case for greater inclusion in everyday life?
I think research is super important, and as we saw in the panel before us, looking to the experts of lived experience is equally or perhaps more important. So the reminder that data shows up in all different places. I really do feel strongly that as the more we learn that people generally do better in the most inclusive, least restrictive environments. Just as you alluded to in your question and your opening, we've learned that people are generally healthier and happier without physical restraints. I saw a lot of comments in the chat about physical restraints. That was a reality of our field, and it wasn't because people are unkind. It is because people thought it was safer. So I think this is a moment for us to ask some questions. In this moment, we generally believe that people are safer in a locked, separate unit or memory care, and maybe we pause to ask some questions about that. And looking to research is a really important place to look. I think neuroplasticity, as you mentioned, is so hopeful, and it just reorients us on this idea that people with dementia can learn and grow. So if the environment supports that, that's a very different kind of environment already. Other ways research can inform our thinking is the fact that there isn't research that supports locked and segregated units. We need more data. We need to better understand the difference between segregated and integrated support for people living with dementia. And in some cases, it may be that a separate, less stimulating environment is better for a few people. And that's where person-centeredness comes into play. I heard I think it was Miriam say, meet us where we are in any given moment. And that is so important for the way we think about the work we do. But we also know from research that the brain processes social exclusion in very similar ways to physical pain. So it activates the pain centers and lowers self-esteem. And to me, that is incredibly strong motivation to think about how we can shift towards more inclusive environments, truly for everyone. But today we're talking about people living with dementia.
Thank you. It's interesting because we've spoken about this earlier and certainly in the previous panel as well, people were talking about this, but Jen, going back to the approach at Carroll Woods, some people who do not have cognitive decline are fearful of seeing on a daily basis people who represent what their future may be, whether it is frailty, cognitive decline, or both. Can you talk to us about that fear when you discuss this with residents at Carroll Woods who are not yet experiencing either of these changes? Where does it come from? And for audience members who may be trying to manage these conversations themselves, how do you try to mitigate those worries so that people can peacefully coexist?
Thanks, Moira. I think this is a question and a topic that's really at the heart of the complexity of dementia inclusion and navigating it and helping it to thrive. You know, the fear, it comes from being human. It comes from seeing a person whose brain is changing and perhaps having some sadness around that for that person, if it's someone that they know. Seeing how a person might act or speak differently and communicate differently, and really wondering if this could happen to them one day, and wondering if they might be embarrassed or something that they do might be hurtful to another person. They wonder if they might be seen as only their dementia. Or perhaps have poor quality of life, not be able to do what's meaningful to them, be dependent, be less than, be seen as other. And it's particularly that being seen as other that helps us understand why segregation does not work. It just adds to the stigma and fear that surround dementia. By separating and othering people based on a diagnosis, we then are, we're literally putting people away and therefore not wanting to see what is a reality of growing older for many of us. And what is also an experience of living with dementia that one can have and live well. The narrative that we have is that living with dementia is purely tragedy and terrible and awful, a no good, horrible, bad day, like the children's book says. And instead, one can indeed have a sense of connection to nature, can continue to have people around them that they love, be connected to their community, walk outdoors, continue to engage in creative pursuits, have a sense of purpose, have a sense of self-worth, be a citizen in their community. That does not need to change. And so it's really important to talk about the fear that that's not the case, the fear that you can't live well, and name all of that. So in conversations with residents, I find it's really important to create a safe space to talk about those fears. That's what's first and foremost, because sometimes we can be afraid that if we talk about something, it'll make it real. But let's talk about it and try to shrink it. The more we say it, the more we can shrink it. There's an emotional aspect to it that just needs to be seen and heard and valued and validated, and make a safe space for doing that. And one of the best ways that we can do that is to uplift the voice of the person who's living with dementia. Make it just part of our community that we talk about dementia, that we talk about it early, we talk about it often. Danielle talked about this as well. If this is just normal and we see people living well with dementia, even though it's a hard diagnosis, we see that there is positive possibility and there's possibility for growth and all good things. So sharing that kind of message is really important. And then
Sorry, go ahead.
I believe in facing fear with facts too. So the more that, as a provider, the more that I can talk about and my teammates can talk about, here's what we do to support you. There's concern that you're going to be dependent. Let's talk about how we approach care planning, how we work together to identify what supports you will participate in and what you can continue to do on your own. It's really important to talk very clearly about what those services and supports are and start planning in advance and get to know that person so that then perhaps that'll lessen some of that fear too.
So for people who are considering moving to Carroll Woods, then are these discussions that you would have right away with them so that they understand that they are moving into a very inclusive community?
It's really important to have the conversation early on. So it is part of conversations with prospective residents. We speak to being inclusive on the website. It's part of the admissions process as well. We discuss being a dementia inclusive community as part of an education series that we have for newcomers. That's our term for folks who recently moved to Carroll Woods. And then ongoing education as well. And I will say this is something that we're really trying to invest in right now. Of course, we had to slow it down a little bit with slowing down group gatherings during COVID. And I found that as we've been coming back, there's been more and more resident interest in partnering with staff to accomplish that education. And so when we have residents and staff working together to help people understand dementia, how the brain changes, how to relate to neighbors as their ways of communicating might change, that then helps to glue us together even more strongly as a community. So early and often is the best way to talk about this.
Danielle, what about for you? Your the community where you work offers obviously a really interesting approach, and you've already touched upon this in terms of inclusion. But I think what it sounds like you're doing is you are enabling the community to connect with the professionals within your organization. And can you just give us some more details about how specifically that might unfold so others could learn from that?
Yes, our IDIC group focuses on everyone, not just those living with dementia, but the greater community as well. But we're starting with our residents and their unique needs and what they can still do. So we all know that everyone's needs are different because no two people are on the same journey when it comes to dementia or any type of cognitive loss. Our education starts on day one when it comes to someone walking through the door. And then we also focus on almost on a daily basis to make sure that our staff and our residents who live here know how important it is to remember that the person that we are caring for or our neighbor is still Mr. or Mrs. Smith. They are still a mom or a dad, a grandma or granddaddy, aunt, friend, neighbor, whatever you would like to call them, but they're not a diagnosis. And I think that unfortunately, sometimes with the clinical side of it, we start with the diagnoses. And when we're giving report or our 24-hour report, so resident Mrs. Smith, she has a diagnosis of dementia. Well, let's talk about the positives. Let's talk about actually about Mrs. Smith and what she can do. We don't need to start with that she has dementia. She's still that person. So that our education focuses on getting back to knowing our resident as a person.
In earlier discussions, you mentioned the hunger for information in the community among locals, and which is really in so many ways a universal feeling among those across North America and beyond, I'm sure, who cannot necessarily afford to live in certain care homes, but still need help. And can you talk about the feeling, this sort of cry for help or this desire to learn more, but not really knowing where to turn?
Yeah, if I may, I'll give you a short story that actually literally just happened probably a month ago. So as I was preparing for this presentation, I got a phone call here at my desk. I'm actually in my office, and I did not know this gentleman. He said who he was, and he said he got my number from a laundromat in Strasbourg. That was cause for concern. So I was like, okay, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And he said, well, oh, I didn't mean like on the bathroom wall. Well, thank you. But he said that he was doing his laundry, and then he ended up talking to this man who was also doing his laundry, who happened to be like I will say it's my long lost uncle, we'll put it that way. No need to go into that relationship, but it was someone who knew me, who knows that my aunt is in a nursing community. And he said, well, call her. She'll know what you're going through and need some help. Okay. And that's wonderful. And I will always be more than happy to help our friends, our families, anyone in the community. So right now at Westminster Canterbury, we've been providing this type of information for 30 plus years. I know that personally, I've been a point of contact for the last 10 years that I've actually worked here. We're in the final stages of formalizing a process to include the 800 number and an email that anyone can reach out to and get information without a hidden agenda. You have to remember it's not just going to be all electronic, because I live in a rural area. Many of the people that I may talk to don't even have access to the internet. They might have to go actually to a library or another public sector to get access. So we're not trying to sell a product either. I'm not trying to sell you, a life plan contract. That's not what I'm trying to do here. Our objective is simply to give back to our community the knowledges and resources that all of the professionals here at Westminster Canterbury have, without asking for anything in return. I mean, if you don't know, but Adult Protective Services and other, government agencies there, they don't have the staff, or they don't have the time to sit down or slow down. We'll put it that way. It's probably better to say it that way, because they have so many cases and they're working short-staffed. Well, we're all working short-staffed, but it is important, I feel, I'm sure most people feel, that we have a responsibility to take care of our older adults. One day we're going to be there, and, we need to be able to do this for them, but to do it for the future older adults too.
So really building that trust in spite of staffing issues, which is one of my next questions for Kirsten. One of the challenging issues in offering more hands-on individual focused approaches is the struggle to find enough frontline staff to do the job. And I know this is a North American issue. It certainly is in Canada as well. But people say sometimes it's a very task-based job, and some people would call it rather thankless. And there are many, many reasons why some have been leaving the sector, particularly since COVID. But do you believe that the adoption of a more inclusive approach would attract workers to the industry, in terms of actually will recognizing our humanity help people come to the industry to be part of that and stay in the industry?
Thank you. I really appreciate this language about recognizing our humanity, and that I think that's a connecting language that feels really important in this conversation. I will share that Jen and I just finished facilitating a multi-week sort of shared learning conversation with about 35 leading age members. And one of the questions or sort of wonderings that a group member brought up to this point about workforce, they said, is it possible we're using the locked door as a staff person? So we're trying to make this job easier using a locked door, which I think is an important question to ask ourselves, sort of why are we locking the door, and what is the intention there? It also feels really important, and I see rolling through the chat, staffing is very hard. Absolutely, to acknowledge this workforce crisis is the language that we're often using. It remains a challenge, though I think in many places it's slightly improved, but it will probably always be a challenge for us. And we can go back to that first question about ageism and ableism being a piece of that puzzle as we think about why is workforce a challenge and why is recruiting team members difficult. I think it's also really important, and I know Jessica Liu Kim is here, but Jessica and Mary Beth Winton reminded us recently of the importance of asking if people want to work with people living with dementia. And that's a question we need to ask everyone. And it's so obvious, and yet it felt really surprising to me when I was reminded of the importance of asking that question. Because regardless of whether you have a separate memory care or where in your community you specialize in supporting people living with dementia, we know people living with dementia are everywhere, right? So wherever you work, likely you're going to encounter people living with dementia, but absolutely in our field, you will encounter people living with dementia in every setting. So the first question we must ask is, do you want to work with people living with dementia? And if not, maybe this isn't a good place for you. But I do believe in general, many people are drawn to more inclusive environments, and in settings that don't segregate often can feel a greater sense of connection for everyone, and that includes team members. I know at Rose Villa, another community that does not segregate based by a diagnosis, describes team members who worked in a locked environment and then, or in a separate environment, and then come to Rose Villa where it is integrated, and it feels there's a sort of an initial culture shock of, like, this feels a little uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and then suddenly, oh, like, I can't imagine going back. This feels good and it feels different. So I think there is something to that, but it's part of what both Jen and Danielle have sort of repeated in many different really important ways, that we have to be really clear. We have to be clear in our marketing materials, and we have to be clear in our outreach to team members that this is what you're coming into. And it's likely a point of strength, but I think it's also about kind of values alignment. But in general, an inclusive community or an inclusive environment is good for everyone. And that means team members as well as those living in the community.
To build on that point, but just to take it slightly off in a different direction, you've spoken about the need for community building within nursing homes and retirement communities. Instead of what appears to be a growing approach, more focused on the hospitality industry. And what is it that you take exception to around the hospitality industry, and why, in your opinion, does that need to change? I think that really flows into what you were just speaking about in some ways, but I'm really curious about that because certainly, with the growing number of older adults, there's a growth in that part of the sector focused more on hospitality.
Yeah, yes. I do feel strongly about this one. I have to credit Jill Vitale Awesome. If you all have not read her book, you must. I believe it's Disrupting the Status Quo of Senior Living, feels like a really helpful resource for this conversation. And her citizenship approach is really important to our field, and certainly to me. I think we can extend radical hospitality or radical welcome in our communities. And I think that is a way that, kind of going to the roots of that word hospitality, to be hospitable, these are things that we need to do in community. But when we shift towards a model where we're thinking of ourselves as a hotel, or I remember placing an ad for what we called an activities director at the time many years ago, and we said, come work at a cruise ship on dry land. That to me is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it's not about community. It's a customer service model that tends to be very transactional. If I go to a hotel, I'm not planning to give anything except pay my bill at the end. I'm expecting to get a lot, right? I'm expecting to get service. I'm expecting to get a clean room, all the things that we expect. when I go to a hotel, or for that matter, get on a cruise ship. And I think that that is not an expectation of a reciprocal relationship, that I have a role in this. And you, both Danielle and Jen, have talked about creating education and consciousness raising and awareness for elders within the community, whether you have dementia or not, what it means to be a good neighbor. If I'm staying in a hotel and someone asks me the same question for the 50th time, I'm probably just going to turn around and walk away. But if I'm living in community and someone asks me the 50th question for the same time, I may, hopefully, having participated in all this education and training, have a bit of a shift in thinking, or at least have a set of skills that allow me to enter into that person's reality and join them. And that's just such a different orientation. I think the other thing that feels really important about this is the customer is not always right. And we know this. Those of us who have worked in senior living know this. And that's okay. It's okay for me as someone that works in a community to say that the way you're acting right now is not okay. It's not a part of the social contract we hold in this community. But if I'm in a hotel, that's probably, it has to be pretty extreme for me to speak up and say, you hold a responsibility as a community member or as a citizen in this organization. So I think there's this sense of responsibility that one holds when we're living and working and operating in a community that one doesn't hold if you're operating within this customer service / hospitality model. So that's where it starts to get really tricky when we're living with a bunch of human beings that can be really difficult, because we know this. And we all live in neighborhoods where, I grab a package off my neighbor's porch and water the tomatoes when they're out of town. So, and I just believe that to be my role as a neighbor. So I think that if we can kind of reorient on what our responsibilities are when we enter into these communities, that sets a different expectation for all of us.
So it's a completely different mindset. And it goes back to, in very simple terms, living with humanity, with for each other, and kindness and empathy, which brings me now to an opportunity to share some questions from the audience. And here's one for Jen, which is just a quick question for you. Someone is asking, what is the most surprising thing you heard when educating family members on inclusion?
That is a great question. I think there's surprising kind of in two different perspectives. I have been surprised when a family member understands that their loved one wants to walk and walk and walk, and at the same time does not agree with that and wants them to be kept safe at all costs. And that, I think, is just my own personal lens on the situation as well. But it can be surprising to not be able to enter into some kind of partnership type of conversation. Lately, I've been delightfully surprised at the advocacy that I've started to hear from family members for their loved one to be able to walk where they want to walk, and to and how they look for technology that can help to support safe walking. Our most recent new technology that we're starting to play with right now came to us as a suggestion from a resident's daughter. So I love being delightfully surprised that folks want to partner more deeply with us and help us to advance inclusion, advance that freedom of movement. But I'm going to think about that one more so. There's got to be, yeah, it's a great question.
Danielle, one viewer wrote, it amazes me that residents without cognitive impairments can be outright mean girls within communities. Are there strategies, techniques, cueing words that can help deter these or better educate those folks? And I know that Jen spoke about that a little bit about, or at length in a sense, about educating people when they come into the Carroll Woods community, but is there something more specific? Have you dealt with a situation like that? And how did you manage through that?
So we have a monthly educational program that we do over our internal channel on dementia care, dementia prognoses, just overall dementia. Each month is a little bit different. So we do have it out there in the forefront of all of our residents, those that are living in higher levels of care all the way to independent living. We also have a dementia library. We have dementia education. We do bring in those from the community that are, specialists, maybe a neurologist that is neuropsychologist, whoever it could be, to give education. And unfortunately, sometimes mean girls are going to be mean girls, and you just have to actually talk to them in private. You need to tell them the facts. You need to tell them the facts that, unfortunately, one day this could be somewhere that they may be, or that this could be one of their loved ones. This was your neighbor. Again, you need to be upfront with them and have a conversation, and just not make them realize, but remind them, as I said before, that is Mr. or Mrs. Smith. That is somebody that, maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, you were having dinner with. It's okay to go visit with them. It's okay to have a conversation. And if you're not sure how to even approach that, I'll go sit with you, and I could be that person to start the conversation.
That's really helpful. We have just a few minutes left. So Kirsten, I'll ask you, it is one thing to have discussions about these issues, but talking about ways in which operators can actually create change. The reason why some people are here today to listen to you, could you share some tangible steps that industry leaders could take to make inclusion a real and a natural part of daily life?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's important. I think I've seen some of you sharing in the chat some of the barriers that we're super aware of, the sort of realities of our field. There's the regulatory realities that vary state by state to make it even more complicated. There's the, fears around safety. There's certainly, how do you make sure that people can walk about safely? That's important. There's the sense that in our culture often that risk isn't an important part of living. So I think we have to reorient on that. And that can be a part of the education too. What do we lose when we take risk out of our lives? And it's a lot. We all take on quite a bit of risk every single day. We get in cars, we walk down the street, we let our children learn to walk, which means they fall about 5 million times. And that is what we sort of know to be the reality. So there's something around having real conversations about risk. We can educate regulators, but I acknowledge it is a steep hill. We can also start to raise consciousness kind of widely across the board, which you hear Danielle is doing in the greater community. You hear Jen talk about it within the Carroll Woods community. So education is my go-to always. And then we can invite everyone to play an important role in the conversation, and that includes people living with dementia. Have you had a panel of people living with dementia, like that remarkable panel that came before this conversation? Bring them into the main space and invite them to share their lived experience. There's something incredibly powerful about hearing and learning from lived experience. And then I think we all, as those of us working in the field, have to think about the identities that we hold and how those inform the way we think about living with dementia. There's something that starts with with me and the way I think about this lived experience, and how that then shifts the way I enter into the conversation. Very briefly, I'll share that I live with a autoimmune disease, and I had the very humbling experience of getting on an airplane where a whole bunch of people with the same disease were traveling to DC to advocate on the Hill. And I was stunned by the way I felt about, one, not wanting to be included in the group, which is something I don't even like to share out loud, but the reality I felt sort of instantly watching people with walkers and canes getting down the aisle and struggling to move, and how hard that was for me. And then to have to stop and reflect on what was happening internally for me, and how much that has sort of softened the way I feel when I see people not living with dementia, reacting to those living with dementia. There are things that happen inside us that are totally counter to the values that we hold. So how can we look at our own lived experience and use that to inform the way we show up for our jobs every day?
Oh, that's so compelling. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's something that we all really need to think about and grapple with regularly, just in terms of these topics and so many more. Thank you to all of you. I have learned so much from this conversation today. Great, great insight. So much appreciated. Charles, back to you.
Thank you so much, Maura. This was just amazing. Jen, I want to thank you, because I think you're the first person that shared with me the work of Maura, and then I got connected with her. Maura, I remember the first Zoom we did together. You shared this thing of, you started a few years ago writing on this particular topic, and I use that sentence still. Your sentence was, it felt like riding in the wilderness, and I'm sure we feel all of that a little bit, right? This is still innovative and new work. But my wish to you, Maura, and actually to the four of you, is that today you felt a little less lonely. I encourage you to look at the chat. There was a lot of amazing reaction. And I just want to thank you for bringing this future, for all of us, actually, a little closer. Thank you very much for that. A better world is a more inclusive world, for sure. Have a wonderful afternoon. Please feel free to stay on. We'd love to have you. Just make sure to unshare your camera and unmute yourself.